We've set up a 20-man committee to do away with this vulgar, animalistic, negative rock and roll bop.
You're watching Asa Carter, an avowed racist who hates rock and roll. I'm David Hoffman, documentary filmmaker, and I want to share with you some thoughts about rock and roll. Why was rock and roll during that time so frightening to people, not just Asa and his racist buddies, but to millions of parents, government leaders, church leaders, school leaders? People really got scared. So if you stick with me on this, I'm going to tell you about rock and roll. Now, I'm not talking about political stuff. Like back in the 60s, we heard 10 to 30-minute songs. Buffy St. Marie singing about American Indians, 10 minutes long. Arlo Guthrie, Alice's Restaurant, 20-some minutes long. I'm not talking about those songs. I'm talking about rock and roll that if you're from the generation of baby boomers, you certainly know these names. And if you're not, you probably know the names also. So let's dig into it. What is it that scared people about rock and roll in the 50s and the 60s and caused such a fracture and gave my generation, the baby boomers, the chance to really rebel against our parents and against the society? So let's go back to the 1940s. Frank Sinatra, dreamy, soft, sweet love songs and other songs like that. Nothing like rock and roll. Now let's look at Black America at the same time. Bebop, jazz, swing, action, dance, faster, rhythmic beating. They were playing that for black people in black concert halls and bars, etc. These two musics were not connected. Now I'd like you to look at the parents of the baby boomers. I know there's a lot of conflict about this on my YouTube channel. There's people who grew up in perfect 1950s homes, and there's other people who didn't. But put that aside for a moment. Let's look at these people and what they had gone through. They grew up in the Depression, the Great Depression. They know poverty, real poverty. They grew up with World War II, where everybody in the country was involved and the whole country was united around a single enemy. And when it came to the 1950s, they had, for the first time, many, suburbia, homes, refrigerators, cars, money. It was an incredible economy. Everybody had a job, and that job supported you. You could have school, you could have a car, you could have health care, all on the single job of a single individual. And when they moved into these suburbias, the white population largely, this new middle class, they wanted to give their children the benefits of what they had. So the teenagers, and I remember this very well, we had money. We not only had money from an allowance, which was a real thing, you could buy stuff with it, but we had easy jobs in the summer and after school. That job gave you money in your pocket, and parents believed that the kids ought to be able to spend their money, that it was not the parents' job to control the kid's money, but that the kid needed to learn how to spend money. I had a small garage sale business out in front of my little house in Levittown, and I sold stuff and I sold other kids' stuff and took a percentage of it, 10%. So I had plenty of money. I had enough money to buy a Boy Scout uniform, buy a bicycle, and buy what I'm about to tell you, records. LPs, long playing records, and 45s, single songs. And why? Well, the first reason is radio. Starting in 1951, this guy Freed comes to New York City and he starts a late night radio show, and he quickly develops an audience, in fact a national audience, and he changes the name to Rock and Roll Party. So almost immediately, parents, government leaders, church leaders, social leaders were against this. And this provided us, the baby boom generation, with our first real split between our parents and us. I'm going to talk more about that. But why did parents react to this new music that way? Many parents and these other leaders disliked the messages. What was this saying? How was this influencing our kids? It had a kind of a sexuality to it, and it was rebellious. It sounded rebellious. And very early on, it was combining white music with black music, with black musicians, even if white singers were singing it. So for a lot of white parents, the races weren't supposed to come together, and they were coming together in this music from very early on. So listen to this. There's this record producer, Sam Phillips. He's fairly well known at the time. And this is what he says. If I could find a white man who had the Negro sound, I could make $1 billion. 2 years later, this man, Sam Phillips, finds Elvis Presley. At the same time, there's this guy, Bill Haley, and he does this song, Crazy Man Crazy. Teenagers are going nuts, and they start buying records like crazy that they hear on the radio. And they hear Bo Diddley, Little Richard, Chuck Berry. Black artists are entering the white rock and roll arena. The more this was occurring, the more that is shaking people up. I want you to hear this quote from Frank Sinatra. This will give you an idea. I love this quote. Rock and roll smells phony and false. It is sung, played, and written by cretinous goons, sexy, lewd, and in plain fact, dirty. That's what Frank Sinatra is saying, and that's what a lot of people are feeling. Now listen to the end of the quote. He says, it manages to be the martial music of every side-burned delinquent on the face of the earth. Sideburns? Sideburns said rebel. If you were here, that was okay. If you were here, that was kind of okay. If you were here, you were a rebel. And in my world, and in a lot of worlds around America, sideburns meant sexy to a lot of girls. And delinquent, where'd that come from? It comes from juvenile delinquent, which comes from a movie. The second major influence on my generation in terms of purchasing power, in terms of separation from our previous generation, in terms of rebellion, movies. For me and for millions of others, the movies were the Saturday matinee. I mean, it packed the theater. And what happened in those theaters? Boys and girls met each other. We held hands. We kissed. Looked like rebels. The parents didn't go, they didn't want to go. And it was really a big deal, the movies. It was like a cultural thing like Friends was for the generation that watched Friends on television. So in 1955, there's this movie, Blackboard Jungle. Inner city, rebels, gangs, sideburns, leather jackets. It's a huge hit. And Bill Haley's Rock Around the Clock, which was in that movie, becomes #1 on the Billboard charts. I remember one of my girlfriends telling me I had to buy a leather jacket. And I did buy a leather jacket. And another one said, you should be wearing a Garrison belt. It's a big, thick belt that gangs used to wear. I wasn't a gang member, of course, and I didn't fight anybody, but I did buy a Garrison belt, which my mother thought was absolutely ugly and couldn't hold my pants up. In these movie theaters, what we witnessed were integrated experiences. Black kids came, white kids came, and sat and watched the same movie and liked it. Same music, same characters. Think of Chuck Berry and Maybelline, which crossed the line, he did also, into white popular rock and roll teenage culture. So let's go back to the parents for a minute. They're looking for a peaceful time. This is the 1950s. The enemies are communism, the Soviet Union. They're the enemies. Inside the American family, it's peaceful, it's father knows best, it's leave it to Beaver. Who wants the influence of rock and roll, the influence of rebellion, the influence of sex, the influence of black and white culture mixed?
These men come down here from New York and from Florida to find out my reasons on rock and roll music and why I preach against it, and I believe with all of my heart that it is a contributing factor to our juvenile delinquency of today. I 100% believe it. And why I believe that is because I know how it feels when you sing it. I know what it does to you. And I know the evil feeling that you feel when you sing it.
What do you think of the mayor of Jersey City doing? I think he's a square, man. He don't know what's happening, that's all. Because rock and roll is cool, you know?
Yeah, I see. Well, now, what do you think?
I think that rock and roll is real fancy rock and roll, and I like it.
Like it? What do you think of the mayor? What do you think?
I think that man must have been nowhere because rock and roll is cool, Daddy, and you know it. Rock and roll is the most, and if they stop that, they ain't gonna have no more music. That music sends me, man. It sends me. You guys dig that music. Go all the way.
There were some Americans who called rock and roll communist. I don't know about anything about that. But funny, in the Soviet Union, they also hated rock and roll, and they tried to block it with their young people because they called it capitalist. They said it was teaching children to buy into all the capitalist things. So neither side thought rock and roll was a good thing among the older generation, among the power people. And then there was the third reason why this generation could separate from the older generation and experience something quite extraordinary: concerts, rock and roll shows. Those of you of any generation who have been to a rock and roll show know that it is unbelievable. The energy, the connectedness, right from the start, rock and roll shows were spectacular. And they were very different from Frank Sinatra or anything that had come before. Of course, they were integrated, and they were taking place everywhere. We were reading about concerts from LA to Kansas to London. And in these concerts and in this music, as I've said before, there was sex. There was Jerry Lee Lewis. There was Elvis Presley and his hips. And we're about to come on the fourth thing that influenced my generation and so separated us with rock and roll: TV. So I want you to think about this for a minute. Prior to TV, we had the radio, which the family sat around and listened to, and had all nice programs: detective stories, murder stories, some talk shows, a few. But it was kind of a family experience. But the TV provided something totally new. You saw people, you heard them out of this little box, and you sit and you watched amazing stuff.
Yes, sir, here he is, the new singing sensation all over the country, Elvis Presley. Come on, bring him in.
So think about this. June 5, 1956, we're all watching the Milton Berle show. It's like national entertainment, really funny. And he brings on Elvis Presley, who does Hound Dog. The performance immediately causes a stir, not because of what he's saying so much, but because of his hip gyrations. And people say, you see, it's those sexual gyrations of Elvis that are causing all these teenagers to go crazy. I know to the younger people this seems a bit odd, but I want to read to you a review in the New York Daily News, which came right after that. Elvis Presley gave an exhibition that was suggestive and vulgar. His animal gyrations are the most distasteful to me and violate all that I know to be in good taste. And then in 1957, I'm a sophomore in high school, another television show appears, American Bandstand, with this guy Dick Clark.
Okay, the song is by Fats Domino. It's fast. If you'll take that side, you folks take the middle. Here's the big beat.
And he's presenting rock and roll and dance on television. In the dancing, there are white couples and there are black couples, and they're dancing in the same location, dancing to the same music. And so the clip I showed you at the start, Asa Carter, I'm going to show you the whole clip at the end of this. He's terrified about what's happening here. Integration is coming. The miscegenation of the white and the black cultures, the mixing, is coming. And he can't stop it. And the cause, he thinks, is rock and roll. Now just watch this dancing. Is this like Frank Sinatra? No. It's completely different, and it is really upsetting to many parents, church leaders, educational leaders, not all, but this idea of the way they're dancing, the mix of dancing, the races, the sexuality. Gotta stop it. Gotta stop it. It's caused by the music. And these rock and roll concerts, which millions of kids were going to, they started to have rock and roll concert fights. Now, were the fights really serious? No, I want to tell you that. But immediately, the local government leaders put in the police. We got to get control of these kids. They got to sit in their seat. They cannot get up. They cannot dance at the concert. They cannot gyrate. Sit in your seat and be quiet. That's the job of the police. So on April 15, 1957, the New York Times runs the headline, "Rock and Roll Fight Hospitalizes Youth." The police, and very often the press, were quick to blame the violence on the black kids and on the music. The facts are, despite the attention, there were really one-on-one fights and very few. And when they did research on this years later, the primary reason for the fights, and there weren't many, were the police stomping on people for getting up and dancing. And that's what they wanted to do, dance in the aisles. I didn't dance in the aisles when I went to these concerts because I didn't think I was good enough. But a lot of people did. The aisles were completely full. Dangerous from the fire perspective, but they never talked about that. Time magazine, 1958, warns that the allegiance of teenagers to rock and roll bears a passing resemblance to Hitler's mass meetings. This psychiatrist, Francis Braceland, he calls rock and roll a communicable disease. I mean, this is serious stuff. Is it not ideal as a rebellious tool? Love the music, which was great anyway, which they so despised and were afraid of. So now I want you to look at this whole thing for a minute from 100,000 feet. Was it rock and roll? Was rock and roll really the troublemaker? Were they right in trying to block it, given their values? Rock and roll had nothing to do with this trouble. The parents never looked at themselves. The school never looked at itself. It never said, what are we doing that is causing kids to rebel this way? First of all, we've given them a great way to rebel. Music, rock and roll, concerts, even on TV, records. But also, we're not looking at ourselves. We're not looking at what we're doing that kids are rebelling against. I have an opinion about this. It's not just mine. The issue is control. The older generation really tried to control the baby boom generation. This generation that some of you say was so great really tried to control everything, your emotions, your behavior, your expressions, your individuality. No good. Could not have worked. The baby boom generation used rock and roll as one of the many things it could find to rebel against an attempt by the previous generation and by the leadership to control expression, to control experimentation, to control the natural rebelliousness of youth. So my opinion, there was no way to stop rock and roll, and I'm glad they couldn't, and I'm glad that it brought the races together and allowed for a more integrated America, giving us new experiences, giving us a chance to express ourselves. You're going to attack this, some of you. You went too far. Yeah, maybe. I think truly we did. On the other hand, the alternative, what the parents and the culture was proposing was untenable. People couldn't do it, even if they tried. The ones who did it were just lying. They were as sexual as the other ones, just hiding about it. So I today, like many of my generation, love that music, remember that music, idolize that music. So now I'm going to play again Asa Carter, the full clip, which I found in my collection and certainly provoked me, so you can understand what it is he's trying to do at that moment. I hope you've enjoyed this David Hoffman analysis. It's my personal point of view. I'm not saying everyone should have it or everyone does, but thank you for watching.
We've set up a 20-man committee to do away with this vulgar, animalistic rock and roll bop. Our committee will check with the restaurant owners and the cafes to see what bebop records is on their machines and then ask them to do away with them. Our committee will judge the records according to who they're by. And if they can't a singer or a new version of this rock and roll bop, they'll play the record and then just use their judgment in whether it should come off or not. As far as we're concerned in Anniston and Calhoun County, as long as the music is played like white people should play it, it's not this animalistic bebop, well, we won't object to it as long as it is a white band.
These men come down here from New York and from Florida to find out my reasons on rock and roll music and why I preach against it, and I believe with all of my heart that it is a contributing factor to our juvenile delinquency of today. I 100% believe it. And why I believe that is because I know how it feels when you sing it. I know what it does to you. And I know the evil feeling that you feel when you sing it. I know the lost position that you get into in the beat. Well, if you talk to the average teenager of today and you ask them what it is about rock and roll music that they like, and the first thing they'll say is the beat, the beat, the beat.